when I think about gender roles and gender expectations, I think a lot about children and adolescents, especially because a lot of the clinical work that I've done is with children and adolescents. And I think one of the most important things that helps a person with healthy emotional development is a sense of acceptance, a sense of being seen and heard and understood for who they are. And I think that when there is sort of this underlying sense that somebody is wrong, or their feelings or their behaviors, their inclinations are wrong or not acceptable, it can do a lot of damage to their psyche, to their emotional development, and at its worst can really create a sense of embarrassment, guilt, and shame, which I think for individual development can be particularly toxic. What kept coming back to me is this concept of vulnerability. And I think that when girls act more, masculine or tomboyish, and I'm using air quotes around these terms, I think that for one, there are more and more, I think, sort of socially accepted models of this. So I think of the U.S. women's soccer team. I think of some of the women doing MMA, and they receive a lot of recognition and prestige for this. And I think that with that, there's sort of a decrease of a sense of vulnerability because they're physically strong. For example, I think when boys might gravitate to more roles or activities that are seen as traditionally feminine, there is an increased sense of vulnerability. People may see it as weak, and I think that a lot of times, especially with how parents react, there's that underlying concern, whether they may be aware of it or not, that their child could be bullied, they could be targeted, they could become vulnerable. So I think that that's probably the main dynamic that comes to mind. And I think that especially in this day and age with the millennial generation and the Generation X before that, I think that there's sort of this progression of those gender roles, changing more and more. But I think that anytime there's a big societal change like that, there's sort of a proportionate backlash, or people holding on tighter and tighter to those sort of older roles and stereotypes. Because I think that this kind of gets down to like a nature-nurture argument. And, I have to admit, before I had kids, when I thought about nature-nurture, I thought that it was like maybe 70-30 nurture, 70% nurture and 30% nature. Especially since becoming a parent, a lot of that has kind of changed for me, and in some ways, it's kind of flipped. I think that kids really are sort of born with a sense of self and identity, things that they like, things that they don't like. But I don't believe that there's necessarily hardwiring along gender lines, and I think that in a lot of ways it becomes almost impossible to really separate those out. Do action figure toys, create sort of a gender stereotype? Or is there something, like you're saying, already hardwired there that just sort of fits and conforms with? But I think that there's so many exceptions. Seeing boys who prefer to play with dolls or to play house, girls who are drawn to matchbox cars and construction equipment, and things that are more traditionally masculine. So I don't know that I have a really good answer for whether there's hardwiring. I think maybe in some ways there are, but ultimately I think the most important thing again is that sense of acceptance, and for kids, the freedom to explore what they're interested in. I think the the biggest concern again that brings up for me, looking at things on a large scale, is again that sort of proportionate backlash, that holding on harder and harder. And I'm sure that for some families growing up in this day and age, accepting those differences, accepting that perhaps gender is a much more fluid kind of concept, may be really really threatening for some parents who grew up with much more rigid gender stereotypes that they were expected to fall into, and that fear that if they do something different with their kids, that they won't be accepted in broader society, or maybe accepted by their extended family of origin. So I can see a lot of ways in which it may be polarizing. It may be very liberating in a lot of ways, which I think is great. But at the same time, I think that it can really increase that sense of fear and rigidity. I think a lot of it's going to kind of get to a critical mass. What is the overall sentiment of the people that they're spending time around? I think that maybe for a lot of people or organizations or institutions, this may be a bit of a tipping point. And I would hope, for example, that say high school athletics coaches would maybe hear from parents and say, hey, you should address this with your players. I hope that it raises consciousness. If I had to guess, I think that in the long term overall, it's probably going to result in more positive change than negative backlash. Maybe that's just my general sense of optimism, but I like a lot of what I see, especially with the millennial generation and their sense of acceptance for differences. I agree that it's a myth. There is clearly a gender wage gap. There's clearly a glass ceiling. I did a little bit of reading up on the gender wage gap, and have found articles on both sides of it. It's a myth. No, it's not a myth. I think it's important to see it in the larger context, though, because even though hopefully increasingly girls and young women are being told you can be whatever you want to be, you can have whatever kind of career you want to have. If those careers have been so male dominated that it creates, and I think it often does, a hostile work environment for women, the additional barriers that creates for women to be and to feel successful, I think it becomes sort of a self-perpetuating cycle, where there are areas that women may want to go into, but because it doesn't feel safe, it doesn't feel respectful, they simply may not choose to go there. So whether it's healthcare, or some of the hard sciences, or I know that just recently, I think the first female NFL referee started working this year. And one of the things that I think about is, boy, if she makes a call that somebody's upset with, what is she going to hear? What kind of potential, verbal abuse might she receive? So anyway, getting back to the gender wage gap and the glass ceiling, seeing it in the larger perspective of how a lot of other pieces of our society perpetuate that, I think is just as important as looking at what starting wages look like and what somebody working their way up a salary ladder may look like. So I think it's much more of a holistic kind of issue. There are a lot of ways that social change happens through formal policies, whether they're laws, whether it would be an equal rights amendment to the Constitution, whether it would be state laws that ban discriminatory wage practices. Because if we're going to talk about wage differences, we also need to look at white versus African American wages versus Hispanic wages, and the gaps there. From the statistics that I've seen, are even more than traditional. Just looking at things according to gender. Um, but I also think that there can be a lot of leadership in the corporate world where large corporations can adopt policies that can start to kind of shift that. Looking at sort of legal routes for doing that, I think is helpful. But I think if it's happening from both ends, if it's happening from the top down with written legislation, and it's also happening from the bottom up with organizations saying we're going to make this change because we think it's the right thing to do. So I tend to look at sort of an all of the above answer. Yeah, yeah, I'm glad you brought up family paid leave because I'm really glad that that's one of the issues that has come up um, in this current election cycle. I mean, a lot of studies show that when men are able to spend time at home with a newborn or with an adopted child, it really pays dividends in the long run. Obviously, clearly for the mother as well. So I'm very, very much in favor of changing, those policies too. Um, the the sort of myth and pressure of having to be the breadwinner, I think also perpetuates a lot of the stereotypes that have men, often become workaholics to measure their overall sense of value and worth in terms of what their income is, or how big their house is, or whatever kind of show of wealth that they have. And I think it further kind of keeps people planted in these antiquated and unhealthy ideas of what men and women are supposed to do and be. I don't have any research to back up my response to this either, but there were sort of two things that came to mind. One, and this is kind of based on some of my anecdotal experience too. One is the sense that women who do choose to work in their home, whether it's raising children or not being in the more kind of traditional workforce. I have heard that some women feel really looked down upon for that, that they are perpetuating those gender stereotypes by the personal choices that they make. Um, I think that's really damaging. I mean, I think my sort of sense of what feminism is the ability for women to choose for themselves who they are and what they do. So that's sort of one example of that. I think that another perception of what feminism is for some people is that feminism is women acting like men, and especially when we're talking about a lot of the negative gender stereotypes and identities around men. Give you one particular example: the TV series Transparent, that I'm a really avid fan of. There's a character. She's a university instructor who is a poet and a feminist, very, very outspoken, has a really big following, but she behaves in a lot of ways that traditional heterosexual white men act, abusing power by, for example, seducing students. And I remember, watching those episodes where those dynamics are coming out, thinking, boy, that's a really interesting perspective on what feminism looks like, because that's exactly the kind of behavior that, especially, being here at a university, really makes my skin crawl. I think that abuse of power is really damaging. And even though this is a TV show and this is, it's obviously dramatized, but I could see that as another dynamic that may, for some people, really turn them off from what they think feminism is. I see a lot of things changing that do give me a lot of hope. I do think they will. I find that, at least in my experience here at the university and with my clients, that the millennial generation seems to have a much greater sense of acceptance for individual differences. I've seen that with my kids. I've seen that with other kids. I've seen that in a lot of ways. And for example, people being out as gay or lesbian in high school, or as transgender. Again, it's anecdotal, but I can think of maybe one person that I knew as being out in high school. I think now it's very normal, at least what I hear and from what I see, for young people to be much more out as gay or lesbian or transgender. I also have here the university has this preferred name policy. I see that as another indicator that change is happening.